22nd, 1945. Hitler is dead. Berlin has been captured. The Nazis have fallen. The war in Europe is finally over. The propaganda said it was a noble victory. Red Army soldiers marching into Berlin and delivering the final blow to the fascist Reich. The evil vanquished, the motherland avenged, the future bright and hopeful. We know that it wasn't that simple. Ideologies built on division and hate can take many forms and evolve in ways that resonate across different periods, even long after a regime has been dismantled. For example, the Alternative for Germany party became the first far-right party to win a state election since the Nazi era. Ground News found more than 500 sources reporting on it, coming from across the political spectrum and the world. And we really love comparing headlines to understand how these biases affect this story's framing. Like left-leaning The Guardian, writing how German Jews are horrified by the AfD's victory, while the centrist German outlet questions what this win means for their nation. As right-leaning NZZ dives into what could be motivating young voters to support extreme ideologies. This resurgence of far-right politics shows us how easily past extremism can find fertile ground in modern society, especially when biased news can manipulate public opinion into supporting such sentiments. That's why we're excited to partner with Ground News again for this video. Their app and website gathers the world's news in one place, so readers can easily find overlooked or misconstrued perspectives to form independent opinions on today's important issues. Even issues the left or right don't want to pay attention to. That's why Ground News made our favorite feature, their blind spot feed, which highlights important news receiving little coverage from either side. It's an easy way to step out of your echo chamber and understand the other side's news reality. We all have a friend or relative we just can't seem to politically agree with, but I think this would really help you have more conversations grounded in facts and less in frustration. So go to ground.news/a-day-in-history or scan my QR code to deeply understand the world we're living in. My viewers save 50% on the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. You might be wondering why we trust Ground News. And it's simple. They're independent and subscriber funded, which means they have your best interest in mind. Now, back to our story. The Allies' moment of triumph after 6 years of war was stained with stories of horrific abuse upon innocent people. The Nazis had turned Europe and beyond red with innocent blood, but the Allies had done their part to spill it too. Not least of all, the Red Army, whose brutal march into Germany was filled with massacres, looting, and unspeakable amounts of rape. When they reached Berlin, the Soviet soldiers inflicted sexual violence upon civilian women on a massive scale that changed their victims' lives forever. What happened? How could it be allowed to happen? How did the victims deal with it? Stick with us to the end of the video to learn the entire shameful story. Let's get right to the point. What exactly did the Soviets do? Simply, the Soviets did what so many armies had done before them, and what they'd already been doing since pushing the Nazis out of Russia itself. Hundreds of thousands, probably millions, in Eastern Europe had already suffered at their hands. In Hungary, even the mental patients at an asylum at Nagy Karl weren't spared. In East Prussia, an area treated with special brutality by the Soviets, half of the known women who survived had been victims of rape. Berliners knew what awaited them. Many fled to the west into the more merciful arms of the Americans and British, but many had no hope of escape. When the Russians entered Berlin, the crimes began immediately. In the words of one Soviet war correspondent, the Russian soldiers were raping every German girl from 8 to 80. It was an army of rapists. The details of what happened are harrowing and brutal. Soldiers, usually in groups, dragged German women from their hiding places to violate them. No one was too old or too young to escape the clutches of the Red Army. In Berlin alone, 130,000 women were mistreated in this way. The worst of the violence occurred during the first 2 weeks of the occupation, when the Red Army was still high on the sense of victory, although women continued to be abused for months afterwards. This was only the start of their suffering, though. The victims lived with the trauma of what they'd experienced for the rest of their lives, whether that was decades or the brief, painful days before they cut theirs short. In 1954, the anonymously written book, A Woman in Berlin, offered a vivid account of the conquest of Berlin through a woman's eyes. The unnamed woman described the many crimes she witnessed and personally suffered during the fall of Berlin. The stories of abuse and degradation of German women were so striking that it was pulled from publication for several years, its contents deemed too horrific for public consumption. The book is full of stomach-churning stories of what the author saw. To take just one example, the book describes the rape of a 19-year-old girl named Gertie, who knew the author. When the soldiers arrived in their street, Gertie had rushed to the basement to hide, but the soldiers found her. They dragged her kicking and screaming up the stairs into a stranger's apartment and proceeded to do unspeakable things to her. When they were done, they took food from the kitchen and smeared her with it, for no other reason than that they could. It was an extra bit of humiliation on top of a barbaric crime. The unnamed author of the book was herself a victim. Her description of her own experience is vivid and upsetting, capturing the same sense of violation and disgust that the other victims faced. She remembered the stench of alcohol and horses that the man had been handling. After her first ordeal, she could only remember vomiting in the sink, disgusted at what had been done to her. The Soviets were indiscriminate with their victims. The book offers another account of a Jewish couple who, having endured the Nazi occupation for years, greeted the Soviets as liberators. The Red Army soldiers simply shot the husband and took the wife away to have their way with her, even as she screamed that she was Jewish. Similarly, leftists and communists weren't spared, despite seeing the Soviets as comrades. Ideological fellow travelers who rushed out of their houses to greet their newfound liberators were treated just as viciously as everyone else. Even Russians weren't safe. Eva Stuhl, who had been born in the USSR and whose family served in the Red Army, was taken to Germany as a forced laborer during the war. She was practically jumping for joy when her countrymen reached Berlin, but that joy turned to pain and despair. The Red Army came and its soldiers dishonored me, she recalled. When she brought the incident to the attention of the soldier's commanding officer and explained that she was actually a Soviet woman, the officer beat her and raped her again. It would have been better if he had killed me, she said. How could the Soviet soldiers do such unspeakable things to civilians? The answers are disturbing. Revenge was an obvious reason. The Nazis had done unspeakable things to the Russian population during their invasion. Some 20 million Soviet civilians were killed during the war, and the men who marched into Berlin counted their own family and friends among them. For many Red Army soldiers, it was an eye for an eye, a life for a life, a rape for a rape. Soviet propaganda encouraged this line of thinking. The Red Army newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, called on soldiers to take German women as the lawful booty due to the victor, and subtly encouraged sexual crimes as a way to break their racial pride. Such attitudes were everywhere, blasting over the radio, exchanged between soldiers over campfires, and plastered over posters. One 1945 poster simply read, "You are now on German soil. The hour of revenge has struck." Despite this, rape was officially illegal and should have been punished under Soviet law. But who was going to enforce that? The officers? Good luck finding any who cared enough about the Germans to step in. The government? They'd never admit their soldiers were committing crimes on such a scale. It wasn't as if the Soviet news media could report anything that reflected negatively on the heroic defenders of the nation either. The records are a testament to this. The NKVD military police, whose job it was to punish crimes committed by soldiers, recorded just one instance of them stepping in to stop a rape by Red Army soldiers in April 1945 in Poland. Other soldiers rationalized their deeds away, insisting that what they were doing wasn't that bad. In one incident in Königsberg, when Red Army soldiers violated a group of women, the women broke down and begged the soldiers to just kill them and put them out of their misery. The rapists were offended. "Russian soldiers do not shoot women," they replied angrily. "Only German soldiers do that." Of course, this wasn't true. Plenty of women were killed by their rapists as well. One Soviet officer speaking to a British journalist gave an especially delusional response when asked about wartime rape. In some cases, he said confidently, it was a good thing. He argued that the soldiers raping elderly women was positive because the older women would love the attention. Another possibility is that alcohol made it worse. Alcoholism was a huge problem in the Red Army, and the celebrations after taking Berlin called for lots of it. It is well known that sexual violence goes hand in hand with alcoholism. Survivors often reported that soldiers were drunk and reeked of alcohol during the attacks. All of that explains the perpetrators, but what about the victims? How did they get through it? Not all of them did, but those who survived used a number of strategies to escape, deflect, or adapt, some of which would fill them with shame and regret for the rest of their lives. Figuring out how to avoid the soldiers was the first priority. Really, you wanted to be out of Berlin before the Red Army arrived, but that wasn't possible for everyone. The women of Berlin quickly realized some tricks though. First, the Soviet soldiers tended to get drunk every evening and roam the streets, which made it the most dangerous time. During what some women dubbed the hunting hours, young women and children would hide in lofts or wardrobes and everyone would stay out of the streets. Those drunk soldiers tended to run out of steam by early morning though. While the soldiers were still in booze-fueled sleep or nursing an awful hangover, that was the safest time to be out looking for food or water. It could easily go wrong though, and many women never had a chance to hide or escape. Accounts showed that most of the attacks were group attacks, with multiple soldiers against one woman. Fighting them off or running away was almost never an option. The coping mechanisms reported by survivors are much like those used by other survivors of SA today. Disassociation and repression tried to bury the trauma or detach the victim from it, but it didn't work for everyone. The emotional consequences of the attacks could long outlast the physical ones, with some women having their lives and abilities to form relationships ruined by the invading soldiers. It's understandable that women tried everything they could to avoid it, including things that filled them with regret. One potential strategy was giving up other women to save yourself. Some women escaped being victims by revealing the locations of other girls in exchange for freedom. This could backfire though, handing the perpetrators 2 victims instead of 1. Other women offered themselves as the bargain. With gang rape being so common, women could expect to be victimized multiple times. So, some women sought protection from the soldiers themselves. By making an agreement with a single soldier, usually an officer or a particularly physically intimidating regular soldier, many German women hoped to exchange their body for protection from the rest of the men. These men were nicknamed Ivans, and thousands of German women managed to lessen their suffering this way, although they were still coercive sexual relationships all the same. Still, they felt it was better to have one abuser who might protect his own property than be vulnerable to the ravages of potentially dozens of others. This approach became more common in the months after the capture of Berlin, as starvation descended upon the population. German women traded their bodies to the officers, who were guaranteed to have food. That way, they might feed themselves or their family. An empty stomach could force people to do degrading things as surely as a gun to the head. The author of A Woman in Berlin was one such woman who found an Ivan of her own. She described him as a single wolf to keep away from the pack. This strategy could work, but it carried deep shame in the years after the war. These women were often accused of being traitors, not victims, and they carried that stigma for the rest of their lives. So where were the German men in all of this? Millions of them were already dead, of course, but what about the ones who weren't? Well, they couldn't do much. Those who were still around when the Red Army marched into Berlin saw firsthand what was done to their daughters, sisters, wives, mothers, and friends. Some men died trying to protect women. The actor Harry Liebke was beaten to death with a bottle by Soviet soldiers as he tried to protect a young woman hiding in his apartment. But such courage was rare and often futile. The idea that they had failed to protect women from the invaders became a deep sense of anxiety and guilt for German men after the war, with many refusing to talk about it out of a sense of failure. Some historians argue that sexual violence has a special place in war, as a symbol of dominance by the perpetrator over the victim's culture. Traditional masculinity holds that it is the man's job to protect the women, so rape is a symbol of the men's failure on top of being a direct crime inflicted upon the women. For the men, to fail to protect their women was to fail as both soldiers and men. Many men could not cope with it and took their own lives or broke off relationships with victims to escape the truth. With so many victims of so many awful crimes, you'd think it'd be impossible to hide. That didn't stop people from trying. The legacy of what happened was hidden in many ways. The Soviet authorities wanted to suppress it. The perpetrators denied it, and the victims wanted to forget it. But it was there in the minds of those who lived it. It was also there in the orphanages that found themselves overrun in early 1946 by a surge of abandoned children, the legacy of what the invaders had done. The exact number of victims can never be known. Two of Berlin's major hospitals treated between 95,000 and 130,000 women as victims of sexual violence during and after the fall of the city. Including the rest of Germany and the other Berlin hospitals, 2 million victims is a reasonable estimate. Exactly how many were killed during the attacks is also unknown. However, at least 10,000 suicides were linked with sexual violence, inflicted by the Red Army in the months after the end of the war. The topic of Allied war crimes, such as the mass rape by the Red Army, has been difficult to discuss. The moralistic view of the perfectly good Allies and the incomprehensibly evil Nazis can be tough to challenge. Painting Germans as the victims of anything in a war that began with them invading their neighbors and was defined by them murdering millions has not been popular. What we need is maturity and a firm moral sense when talking about the war. What the Nazis did was evil, but some of what the Allies did was evil too. War is never as simple as good versus bad, and while we can recognize that one side was the greater evil, that should not make us switch off our own morality and give the stamp of approval to atrocities by our own. It should also be remembered that people are not their governments. Too often, civilians face the punishment for things that politicians or soldiers did. What seems like revenge is really a new injustice inflicted upon people who had no responsibility for the original crime. In the words of one historian, some Germans were victims, some Germans were perpetrators, and some were both. The horrendous crimes committed by the Nazis against the Soviet Union should never be forgotten. But while their crimes help us understand what the Soviets did in Berlin, it does not excuse them.